Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. For anyone tuning in from the US or really anywhere outside of the land down under, the way Australia runs its government might seem like a bit of a mystery. Well, today we're taking a fascinating top-down look at exactly how political power is constitutionally carved up across Australia's three-tiered system. We're going to unpack the federal, state, and local governments, look at exactly what they do, and see how they occasionally step on each other's toes.
Okay, let's dive into our roadmap for today. First up, a broad overview of the three tiers. Second, federal and state powers. Third, local government rules. Fourth, sharing health and education. And finally, funding the three tiers.
All right, Section 1, the three tiers overview. We're talking the macro, meso, and micro.
Let's look at this descending hierarchy of the Australian government. At the very top, covering the entire country, you have the federal government, and that's led by the Prime Minister in Canberra. Take a step down to the state level, covering individual states, and you have a government headed by a premier. And finally, you drop down to the micro level, local government, like your city or shire councils, which are led by mayors or shire presidents. Now, to understand how laws actually get made at those top two tiers, we've got to talk about the bicameral system. That's just a fancy word meaning there are two houses, like the Senate and the House of Representatives, and bills have to survive passing through both to become a law. But then there's the unicameral system, which means just one house. Queensland famously decided to scrap its second house way back in 1922 because, well, they figured one was plenty. The Australian Capital Territory and the Northern Territory are unicameral too, but as territories, the legislative power is quite a bit more limited than actual states.
Moving on to Section 2, federal and state powers. Who rules what?
So we have these massive bodies of government, right? But where exactly is the line drawn? And more importantly, what happens when a state law completely clashes with a federal law? Enter Section 109 of the Australian Constitution. This is literally the ultimate trump card. It dictates that if there's a conflicting law on the exact same subject between a state and the federal government, the feds can just override any conflicting element of that state law. Simple as that. As long as it's constitutionally allowed, federal law reigns supreme.
To see exactly how Section 109 plays out in the real world, just look back at what happened in 2013. The Australian Capital Territory actually legalized same-sex marriage. But the federal government challenged it, played that federal trump card, and the High Court undid the territory's law by December of that very same year. The territories just didn't have the scope to fight it. Fortunately, skip ahead just 4 years to 2017, and marriage equality passed at the federal level, making it the law of the land all across Australia anyway.
And this brings us to Section 51 of the Constitution, which lays out exactly what the federal government is allowed to control. And it reveals a rather funny historical artifact. You have to remember the year was 1900. That's when this was written. So alongside giving the federal government power over the major things like defense, immigration, marriage, and currency, the Constitution explicitly gives them jurisdiction over, wait for it, lighthouses. Yep, lighthouses. Because back in the year 1900, the Prime Minister's stance on lighthouses was absolutely vital to the nation's survival.
Let's break down who is actually responsible for what here. The federal level handles the big picture, national issues, defense, immigration, the post office, and of course those incredibly important lighthouses. Dropping down a tier, the states handle pretty much anything not covered federally: police, prisons, education, and public transport. And hey, this is exactly why if you travel interstate in Australia, you're going to find you need a completely different, totally incompatible public transit travel card for every single capital city. You can absolutely thank the state governments for that. And finally, local government takes care of the immediate day-to-day community elements, things like garbage, local parks, and pet control.
All right, Section 3, local government rules, the hyperlocal. Let's take the elevator all the way down to the micro level to see what your city or shire council is actually up to. But before we get into the wild rules of local government, there is one major local institution you absolutely need to know about: the local library. As our source perfectly puts it regarding local libraries, support them, get close to them, learn their secrets. And hey, while you're out there learning their secrets, why not hit the like button, share this explainer, and subscribe to our channel for more? It really helps us out.
And this brilliantly illustrates the hilarious specificity of local councils. Remember how we mentioned pet control? Well, your local council is the body that legally dictates exactly what animals you can keep in your backyard. They're the ones who officially ban you from keeping a camel, a llama, or an emu in suburbia. They're the ones who will tell you that you can legally own exactly 6 chickens, but absolutely 0 roosters. And in some areas, the strict legal limit for pigeon ownership is exactly 30 pigeons. Not 31, 30. I mean, that is the true, raw power of local government right there.
Moving right along to Section 4,
sharing health and education, the messy crossover.
Up until now, we've painted a pretty neat, tidy picture of who does what. But in reality, it's not always perfectly separated. Let's look at the messy, intermingling reality of crossover duties, starting with healthcare. For our viewers in the US, this is a highly relatable topic. At the very top, the federal government funds Medicare. This is the foundation of the Australian medical system, and it prevents US-styled medical bankruptcy. But bizarrely enough, the federal health department is also tasked with protecting the community from nuclear radiation. I suppose it's somewhat comforting to know the federal government is keeping the country out of a Fallout-style wasteland while also paying for your doctor's visits, right?
But really, health and education are a joint effort across all three tiers. It's like a giant puzzle. Federally, they fund Medicare and higher education. But at the state level, they're the ones actually managing the public hospitals and running the school departments. For example, the federal and state governments will often split massive multi-million-dollar funding packages just for individual hospital networks. Then, dropping down to the local level, they're managing community food safety standards and, in many states, handling preschools and kindergartens. It is a deeply intertwined system.
Finally, Section 5, funding the three tiers, following the money.
It's time to conclude our structural breakdown by finding out exactly how these massive overlapping systems are actually paying for all of this. There are primary revenue streams for each tier. The federal government relies really heavily on income tax, corporate tax, and the GST, which is the goods and services tax. The state governments have their own ways of raising funds, leaning on things like land tax, transfer duty when you buy a house, and gambling taxes. And then down at the local government level, they rely on council rates. These are essentially local property taxes paid by homeowners to fund the community parks, the local roads, and garbage collection.
Now, what's super interesting about this funding dynamic is the hidden relationship between the tiers. Despite having all those state-level taxes we just mentioned, state governments are not self-sufficient. In fact, they depend on the federal government for more than half of their entire funding. The federal government collects the lion's share of the tax revenue nationwide, and then they have to distribute it back down to the states so they can actually keep the lights on in their hospitals and schools.
Because these governments have such a profound impact on everyday life, from funding Medicare all the way down to deciding how many pigeons you can own, Australia mandates participation. Voting in federal and state elections is strictly compulsory. If you are a citizen, you have to show up or you get fined. Voting is also compulsory for local elections in most places, with exceptions for Western Australia, South Australia, and Tasmania. Oh, and while voting might be legally required, subscribing to this channel is completely optional, but, highly encouraged.
So, that brings us to the end of our explainer on Australia's macro, meso, and micro civic structure. I want to leave you with this final thought. How do the specific powers of your local government compare to Australia's quirky three-tiered system? Does your local council ban camels, or do they handle something completely different? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and we will see you in the next explainer.